I am real late in doing this. Again. I planned to make my yearly recap a lot earlier, but I really wanted to get those last two reviews done first, especially before Elden Ring comes out. Like the previous years, this is my games and movies of the year list based on what I reviewed in 2021, as opposed to what actually came out that year. And I'm including those last two reviews in here as well. Starting with the movies, I first want to bring up a few notable mentions. I meant to review this one, but I never got around to it. Kate isn't groundbreaking, but it is a very fun action movie. Simple and predictable story, but with fun characters, cool set pieces, and great choreography. If I did review it, it would easily be Movie of the Year, although that probably says more about the other movies on this list than it does about Kate. Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City is probably the best of the live-action renditions so far, and I hate to say that because it's still absolute trash. I appreciate some of the set design and adaptation of the source material, but so much of this is still a mess. There are way too many plot threads going on at once, the story pacing feels very rushed, and Lisa from the Resident Evil 1 remake is used terribly in this movie, and in a way that hardly makes any sense. At least the movie knows how to have fun and not be so pretentious, which places it above any of the Paul W.S. Anderson attempts, but it's still not great. Since I've reviewed pretty much everything Resident Evil so far, I'll likely get around to this one too at some point later. And finally, oh boy, Malignant. Even for a horror movie, this one is totally nuts. I would have been okay with it on the grounds of being so bad it's good, but there's also a lot of the movie that's very boring and very stupid. The only thing keeping the audience invested is the mystery aspect, and when you get to the plot twist and see that final scene play out, that's when it's all worth it. Definitely look into it if you want something completely bonkers and off the wall, but don't expect it to be any good. Alright, now for the movies I actually did review. The only movie I've ever given a 0 out of 10, and I'd argue it's for a very good reason. The story and characters make absolutely no sense whatsoever. For a franchise that's already very loose with its retcons, this one takes it to a new low. They even go so far as to kill off a majority of the previous cast off screen and with barely any mention. On top of that, the usual lame story and poorly utilized characters remain, and the action is just as bad as always. It's such a terrible movie that I honestly find it insulting. It's seriously one of the worst movies I've ever seen in my life. And it just so happens that Afterlife is right up there as another one of the worst movies I've ever seen in my life too. While none of the previous films were remarkable, this is the one that gets really blatant about it being a money laundering scheme. A ridiculous over-reliance on 3D and slow motion effects compromises every shot, and the green screen is more obvious than ever. It's not as bad as the final chapter, but it's not for lack of trying. Rounding out the bottom three, it's another awful Resident Evil movie. At the very least, this one has a couple of nice action scenes, and there's some variety in the backdrops. I am really grasping at straws though. It's still an awful movie with a stupid, boring story, dumb characters, etc, etc. This one has a little more fun with its setting than the others on this list, but that's hardly enough to salvage it. Greenland is just boring, and I mean super boring. It's fine to take a disaster movie and focus on the human element more so than the action and adventure, but the characters in this are extremely one-dimensional and they don't develop at all. It's such a lame movie, and I hate how emotional it tries to be when I just don't have a good reason to care. And yet another boring movie. After how much fun Vendetta was, and the fact that it ends on sequel bait, I was really looking forward to this. Go figure that it's instead a prequel and it's just as bad as Degeneration, the first Resident Evil animated movie. This one tries to be pretentious with its story, but it never gets it right, while the few action sequences aren't nearly as good as in the previous entries. Go ahead and watch it if you're curious, but don't expect much. Not content with ruining just one Capcom franchise, Paul W.S. Anderson tries his hand at another. All things considered, the Monster Hunter movie could be a lot worse. I mean, it's bad, but its biggest problem is that it's extremely generic with its character usage and story progression. It hits all the typical Hollywood notes. It's pretty upsetting because the monster designs and animations are great, but you don't actually see them that often, and only 2 monsters get any significant screen time. The main character being a gung-ho soldier from another dimension is an additional kick to the balls that this movie didn't need. And it goes to show how out of touch the writer, director, and producer was. That's right, it's another one-man show from Anderson starring his wife yet again. Why would you expect anything different? Man, you know we're in trouble when Doom starring The Rock is in my top 3. What a crappy years for movies I wasted my time watching. Well, shockingly enough, it is better than I expected. Some nice set design, some fun characters, some absurd action. At least it has a tiny bit of something going for it. Still, the story is awful, the acting is laughable, and the first-person segment towards the end is just insulting to any Doom fan. Nothing to see here, don't bother. There's not much to say about this one either. It's mostly a neat novelty for the fans rather than a legitimately good movie, but even on that point, it is odd how it needlessly changes some plot elements that were already established in the original game. The action is really lame and the animation is subpar, but the setting is cool and the art style is alright. Not too bad of a movie overall, but nothing real special. Don't feel obligated to have to seek this one out, even if you are a fan. It's the famous Top Gun 1980s macho romance flick about aerial dogfights. This one's just okay. Although the character interactions are fun, it's kind of boring, unless you can really get into the dialogue. The dogfights are well done, I think even by today's standards. Don't feel like you're missing much if you don't care to watch this movie, but you could do a whole lot worse too. Moving on from the movies, I'll get into my top 14 games soon, but I want to mention Operation Tango. I recently streamed the whole game with my good buddy, One Doomed Game Critic, and we were both surprised by how good it is. There were some connection issues that required a couple of restarts. A lot of the segments are extremely gimmicky, and the game's rules tend to change pretty drastically from mission to mission. But it's a fun adventure and one of the better examples of a good asymmetrical cooperative game. It also helps that it's pretty cheap to buy too. If you have a like-minded friend, I highly recommend this. I also streamed Cuphead, and that game's a trip. I wish I had played it sooner. It controls well, great boss fights, and fantastic animation. It's a game I definitely plan to review at some point because I have a lot to say about it, but the short of it is that it's well worth playing. Too bad it's also extremely short. On to the games that I did review, we're starting out with Top Gun at the bottom of the list. This weird retelling of the events of the movie is brought down by poor presentation and repetitive gameplay. It's not necessarily bad, but it's so mediocre and lacking in features that there's almost no reason to ever play this game, especially in comparison to the competition. The only thing worth seeking this out for is the awful voice acting. Luigi's Mansion 3 really sucks. This is one of the most boring games I've played in a long while. The presentation is okay, it's about what you'd expect from Nintendo and next level games. And the gameplay has the potential to be decent, But it's such a slow game to the point of being absolutely miserable, and it's so easy that you'll never lose unless you actually fall asleep while playing, which is not unlikely. It might be an okay game for the kids or for very casual players, but that's about it. The Resident Evil ripoff with a weird development history. I'm all for lower budget games by amateur developers, but they gotta be realistic with their expectations and goals. Daymare tries to do way too much and it ends up going nowhere. The completely nonsensical story almost makes it worth it, but that's definitely not a compliment. It's hard to even call this a poor man's Resident Evil on a budget, it just sucks. Similar to Daymare, this is another budget title by a no-name studio, but at least they stay more focused on what they're going for. The combat is lame, the puzzles are ridiculous, and the story is balls. But it does actually kind of feel like a long-lost survival horror game from back in the PS2 days. Maybe it's my bias, but I can respect it a little bit for that. This might be the most frustrating game I played last year. The gameplay is pretty damn good, way better than the first game, but there is so little of it that it doesn't actually matter. The majority of time is spent on the story, which is an embarrassment. It's so artificial to present some major threat of a villain and then have the game pull the rug out from under you to try and make you feel bad for her. That is not good storytelling. The game as a whole is just barely competent enough, but this should not be deemed acceptable from a AAA developer. While the gameplay in this first entry isn't anywhere near as good as its sequel, at the very least it is paced a lot more effectively. There are too many moments where the game just straight up cheats and spawns in enemies from out of nowhere, but at the very least I can call this more of a game than a movie, which is more than I can say for part 2. It also helps that the story actually tries to be good, rather than resorting to a terribly stupid twist. Chorus is kind of mediocre and a little misguided, but I give it respect for being a budget title from a smaller developer. They had an idea in mind, and while I don't entirely agree with how it turned out, it's not really so bad either. If nothing else, it's pretty unique in what it goes for, and I can respect it for that. I always heard of Onimusha described as Resident Evil with samurai, but in a similar case to when I reviewed the Dino Crisis games, I don't quite agree with that sentiment. The similarities are there, of course, in particular with the camera angles and controls, but the game as a whole is clearly going for something totally different. Anyway, Onimusha is really weird and it does some dumb and unnecessary stuff, like a level up system for starters. But that said, it's a pretty cool game. It controls well and it's fun to fight demons. It stands out for what it is, and I'd say it's still worth playing today, as long as you can keep your expectations in check. I know this one's a major cult classic that everybody loves, and I want to love it too, but any game that has dynamic difficulty scaling is on my bad side right off the bat, and this one takes the concept way too far for my liking. It's a shame because outside of that, I think the game is great. A little bit tough to control, especially when dealing with multiple enemies, but it's a very solid game overall. If you were to play it more casually, then I think it's a fantastic game, but I couldn't get over the drastic difficulty spikes that occurred just because I was doing too good. That never felt right to me. Dead Space is pretty good. It leans into its unique take on combat and it does so well, on top of having great environment and monster designs. The audio implementation is bad and the weapon balancing is atrocious, but it's a fun and straightforward game that does very little to waste your time. Nothing special enough to make it a must-play, but I do think it's a great game within its genre. Back when I reviewed Resident Evil 7, I said I really wanted Capcom to try their hand at this first-person style again and get it right. This isn't exactly what I had in mind. Resident Evil 8 is good, but it does have more than a few problems with it. About a quarter of the game just feels like filler, and only the early parts make real good use of exploration and level design. You know, what's typically the hallmark of a good Resident Evil game. Weapons and currency balancing is also a little all over the place. It's less focused than Resident Evil 7 was, but it also does more creative things as well. I kind of go back and forth on which one I think is better, but I did enjoy both games a lot and would recommend each of them. After how disappointing the first Paper Mario was, the one on N64, I was afraid that I wasn't going to like this one as much as my childhood memories had led me to believe either. Thankfully, this wasn't the case at all. Thousand Year Door is awesome. It has a few slow moments here and there on top of a little too much backtracking, but the pacing overall is good, the combat and enemy variety are great, and the writing is fantastic. Such a good game. I still think that Bug Fables is better, but Thousand Year Door is also an excellent game. Control was a major surprise for me. It starts off so slow, both in terms of gameplay and storytelling, but it does pick up eventually and is so worth sticking through to the end. The combat is creative and so fun, but it's also very accessible and easy to control. There are some balancing issues here and there, and sometimes it's more aggravating than it should be to navigate the environment, but when it does get good, holy hell is it good. The DLC is pretty solid too. If you enjoy the main game, then I'd suggest checking that out as well.
Mankind knew that they cannot change society. So instead of reflecting on themselves, they blame the beasts, heaven, or hell.
Anyone who knows me knows that this one was obvious. Guilty Gear Strive is easily my most favorite fighting game of all time, finally usurping my previous favorites of Marvel vs. Capcom 3 and Persona 4 Arena. The controls and mechanics are accessible enough for beginners to get into, not to mention the fantastic mission mode as the game's tutorial, yet there's still plenty enough depth to it that matches are always exciting. The visuals are awesome, the music is amazing, and perhaps most importantly of all, the netcode is not absolute garbage. Although it, of course, will still have hiccups. The game would almost be perfect, but there are a lot of issues that I have with it. The single-player content is extremely lacking, especially in comparison to the previous games. Strive's unique approach to online lobbies and matchmaking isn't something that I agree with. Even after all the hours I've put in, I still would have preferred a traditional ranked matchmaking system. However, where it really counts, the raw gameplay is so good. Every character is drastically different from the others, and the Roman cancel system helps add so much to the game while still being very easy to utilize. I still have a lot of complaints here and there, but overall, I am extremely happy with this game. After Street Fighter V and Dragon Ball FighterZ didn't really catch my attention as much as I was hoping, I'm so glad to have found a fighting game that I can fall in love with all over again. Easy, without question, my game of the year. That's another year done and finished. This might have been my slowest year yet, and it's entirely because of Guilty Gear Strive. I thought the Final Fantasy XIV reviews would have been the worst that it would get, but Strive really hooked me in like no other game has in recent memory. And a big part of that definitely has to do with having local tournaments and friends encouraging me to get better every step of the way. I'll try to continue to balance both. I definitely don't want to stop doing reviews, and I'm very excited of what's to come. If you're checking out my stuff for the first time, or if you've been around for years now, I just want to say thank you so much for watching. Here's to more reviews, and hopefully more tournament wins with Guilty Gear.
Jellyfish, victory!